So not right now, but when we get going. So okay, but I have the authority to do so, so that's fine. Okay, great. Then okay. We do have 26 participants, 27. We're all live now already, right? I think we are. Then we may then indeed kick off. Hello and welcome everybody to this ICAP webinar on electricity market regulation and how it relates to emissions trading. We're happy to see so many of you joining us today to discuss how electricity market regulation and emissions trading interact. This will be the third webinar in a series of ETS of webinars for policy practitioners, which is an activity that we're implementing on behalf of ICAP, the International Carbon Action Partnership, and with kind support from the European Commission. After looking at the industry sector in the last discussion, today we want to turn to the energy sector and see how the carbon price can contribute to decarbonizing the energy sector, and in particular also how the regulatory setup of the energy sector, how that enables or disables certain functions of the carbon price. Now, first, a few housekeeping remarks. First of all, to introduce myself, my name is Benjamin Gerlach. I'm a senior fellow with the Ecological Institute and had the pleasure of being strongly involved in ICAP's capacity building activities over the years, organizing a total of, 20 or so summer schools in different parts of the world, and discussing emissions trading in different contexts, including also with Javier, who is joining us today as one of the panelists. Now, we will be discussing for 90 minutes. We have 3 segments. In the first segment, we'll have presentations by our 3 panelists, by our 3 speakers. So William will give the input presentation, and then Cyril and Javier will respond to William's initial presentation. After that, we have a little segment of a moderated discussion where I'll be shooting questions at the panelists, and then after that, we open up to a general discussion with you. So you're welcome to pose your questions. You're welcome actually to already do so now through the question and answer function. So if you have a question, please use that functionality. It's at the bottom of the screen. If you hit it, you can enter your question there. I think you can also vote on the questions of other people if you find them interesting. But in any case, that's a tool for us to collect the questions that you have, and we'll use them then in the question and answer session at the end of the session. All right, and if you do enter your questions, please also indicate if they are directed at a particular speaker, then just indicate in your question to whom you want to address that question. Now, and then let me move on to first introducing the speakers. And some of you may have noticed that the lineup has changed a little bit to what was previously announced. Because we did have to replan a little bit. So we're very grateful to have William Ackworth from ICAP joining us, and we're happy to have Javier Toro joining us from Brazil. But then the new face that was not announced is Cyril Castissa from the IEA. And he's come on very, very much on short notice. I think it was just last Friday that we learned on Friday that Jesse Scott from Agora Energiewende would not be able to join us, unfortunately. And therefore, we then reached out to Cyril, and we're very glad that he agreed on very short notice to come on and to join this discussion. The only downside being that left us with an all-male discussion, which we of course want to avoid, but in this instance, we're not able to avoid. Now, then let me introduce quickly the 3 panelists. We have William Ackworth joining us. He's the head of secretariat at the International Carbon Action Partnership, and many of you might have met him in that function, as he was also involved in very much involved in the capacity building activities that ICAP is organizing. Beyond that, he also works on other aspects of emissions trading, from carbon leakage to industry sector decarbonization, but also specifically relevant for today on this issue of electricity market regulation and how it interacts with carbon pricing. He's done that at ICAP, but before that also already at DIW, the Institute for Economic Research in Berlin, and before that even going longer back in Australia, working on carbon markets in different functions. At that time, however, in the agriculture sector more, which is going to be the topic of the next round of discussion in a month. But for today, it's the electricity part of the story. So William is joining us from Berlin. Then we have joining us from Paris, Cyril Cassisa, who is with the International Energy Agency, the IEA, and there is expert on energy and climate policy analysis and coordinates the environment and climate change team at the IEA. Cyril, very interestingly, has spent a lot of his professional career in China. First, a big part of his education, his university education was in China, but then also he's worked there for some time, and in total spent 10 years in China, and so therefore knows, I mean, through his work, of course, also knows the context of other countries, but also knows the Chinese context particularly well. And therefore, I would, of course, also knows a thing about or two about regulated electricity markets and what that spells for carbon pricing. And then the third panelist today, Javier Toro, is currently energy consultant at the German Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, GIZ. And he is an energy sector economist. He has a PhD actually in econometrics from the University of Sao Paulo. And as part of his PhD, actually investigated price elasticities and income elasticities for in the Brazilian energy sector. So knows the numbers inside out. And before this PhD, also graduated in energy management from Columbia University and Sao Paulo, the Sao Paulo School of Economics. So a very distinguished panel that we've put together for you here. Then let us turn to the topic of the day, which will be the electricity market and what carbon pricing can do to it, can do for it, and how it works together. And in the textbook case, obviously, the electricity market is the ideal candidate for carbon pricing, and therefore it's a little surprise that of all the systems that exist in the world, almost all of them include the electricity sector as one of the first sectors, sometimes the only sector they cover. And the reasons being that the electricity sector is a sector that is very much prone to trading. Its inputs, its outputs, it functions often enough on the basis of sort of economic principles, and optimizes inputs and outputs based on the relative costs. And therefore, the promise is that with carbon pricing, you add another cost component into that interplay of different factors, and the optimization of the market will then ensure that you end up with the least cost outcome. So it's kind of in that sense, the ideal candidate. However, this is, as I sketched it, mostly the case for a liberalized electricity system, which is not what we do find in reality around the world. So in reality, we do have things like regulated power prices. Often enough, we have dominant state ownership of assets or of other infrastructure, or state-run power companies. And so therefore, these factors can, of course, then lead us away from the textbook ideal and put us into a situation where not all of the efficiency gains are workable. And so today we want to take a moment to explore what happens then if carbon pricing happens in not fully liberalized electricity markets. What are sort of other ways forward, other options, can and should there be more liberalization, or is there a role for companion policies to play a role in that? So those are some of the questions we want to discuss. Before I invite William to start with his initial impulse, I wanted to get you, the audience, active by answering a few questions that we've prepared. And to that, I will now share the first question. So we will do this on a tool called Mentimeter. And the way it works is that you open a browser window or get out your mobile phone or whatever you want to do and head for a site called menti.com. So enter menti.com. You will be prompted for a code. The code, you can see it at the top of the screen, is 3101220. If you enter that code, you should see the question here, which is on the screen. And the first one has arrived. So the question is, we're all sitting in front of computers or screens. We're using electricity as we speak. The electricity that you use right now, is that covered by a carbon price? Yes or no? And we have now 15 answers coming in so far. And of these, now going to 16 of these. So the vast majority of us, of you joining us today, is actually living in a place right now where there is a carbon price on electricity. Oh, okay, the first one who isn't quite sure about this. And other than that, so we've got 20 and or approaching 20 and 3/4 have a carbon price covering their electricity consumption. Now we'll move on to the next question, which is, I would ask you, if you take the carbon price, if you consider how important it is for decision making in the power sector, and I would ask you specifically about operational decisions, which is the question of, which power plant is dispatched first. So do you use more gas, more coal, or other power plants, or for investment decisions? So just on these two dimensions, rate the importance and thereby also sort of tell us where you think the power prices, the carbon price, is more important. Okay, so we've got again about roughly 20 answers coming in now, and most of them, I mean, almost all agreeing that the carbon price is important for the power sector, but actually with a slight, I'm not sure whether it's statistically significant, but there's certainly a slight majority saying that, or a slight bias towards the investment decision, that the power price might actually be more important, relatively speaking, for investment than for the operational decisions. Great. So that's 22. We'll move on to the third and last question that I have for you. And that goes exactly to the issue of electricity market liberalization. And the question, how important do you think it is that the carbon price is passed on to electricity consumers? Is that crucial for the functioning of the ETS, as the first three respondents say, or is it less important? So we have, starting with crucial, but now a bit of a more balanced take coming in, and also the first few people saying it's actually not that important. There's other things how the carbon price can help us. Great. So again, we're at approaching about 20 respondents here, and there is a strong signal coming out that it's either very important or even crucial, and a few people who say, perhaps is actually not that important, and it can still be a useful tool even if there is no cost pass-through. Great. So thanks to all of you for sharing your opinions. That was just to get a bit of a flavor of what the opinion in the room is. We'll stop the screen share here so we can then hand over to William, and William can sort of take it away from here and give us your introduction to how the ETS and electricity market regulations are related. Thanks, William.
Okay, many thanks, Benjamin. And also, hello to everybody out there. Many thanks for joining for what I think is going to be a really interesting discussion. Already, it was quite fascinating to see the sort of diversity of opinion to some of those questions. And that's a nice function of Mentimeter, that you can see the distribution there. And so hopefully that serves us well for the discussion. But Yeah, Benjamin, thanks for the kind introduction. Very quickly, if anybody does not know who ICAP is, we are the International Carbon Action Partnership. We're a governmental partnership for jurisdictions that have implemented mandatory cap and trade programs. And what we aim to do is to provide a forum first for policymakers to come together and to exchange and to share on their experiences of actually implementing emission trading systems. But we also aim to take that experience and engage with policymakers and key stakeholders in jurisdictions that are considering emission trading systems through our capacity building work. And we also strive to communicate what's happening in the world of policy developments to a broader audience through various tools and publications, which you can find on our website. So by means of an overview today, hang on, I'm just going to start my timer so I don't absorb too much of the time. But what I wanted to do is take us through basically four broad points where we look at why is sort of emissions trading so attractive, particularly for the power sector? So what is it that we really hope to achieve through this tool? Then looking at how this operates in a liberalized power sector, and what are the channels of mitigation that you can think that the carbon price can sort of leverage in a liberalized power market. And then looking at what sort of obstacles or barriers certain types of regulation can put up, and thinking about, well, are there ways in which we can tweak the design of a classic emission trading system so that we mimic some of the benefits that we actually achieve in a market-based setting, but still implementing this in the context of a regulated market. And then I will have some concluding thoughts. So why is it that we are interested in emissions trading systems? Well, first and foremost, the cap of an emissions trading system is a really important way of basically putting an upper limit on the emissions that are coming from the covered sources. So the cap approach is consistent with this sort of carbon budget approach to say, well, we know that there's a fixed amount of emissions that we can put into the atmosphere before we start seeing some pretty serious consequences of increasing temperatures. So by placing a cap and then allowing the cap trajectory to decline, this is a pretty sensible way of sort of directly dealing with the problem. But then by basically allocating allowances and allowing a market to trade these allowances, we can also achieve two benefits. So we can basically achieve the target in least cost. This means that by allowing trade, those allowances end up with those people that value them most. In economics terms, we can say that marginal abatement costs are equated across the covered entities. And this means that we achieve targets at least cost. If we also introduce some intertemporal flexibility with banking and borrowing, we also provide flexibility for participants to reduce their emissions when it is cheapest for them to do so. So this may allow delaying some investments until sort of existing capital has sort of reached its end of life, and then investing in those new low carbon options. It may also mean doing more today and banking allowances for when we know that it becomes more expensive in the future. So by basically capping allowances and creating a market signal, we put in place an infrastructure that creates an incentive to move away from high carbon goods and services, but also over the longer term communicates a signal that high carbon assets, high carbon goods and services will no longer be profitable or valued in our long-term economies. And so thinking about this a little bit more in terms of those mitigation levers, by doing this, we send a signal to producers that producers have an incentive to use lower carbon materials. So when we think about this in the electricity sector, by actually pricing greenhouse gas emissions, these then become a consideration in their operation decisions. So they understand that the greenhouse gas emissions have a cost, and therefore they have an incentive to reduce them in their electricity production. When the price is passed on to consumers also have an incentive to actually reduce their electricity consumption. So this can be through shifting to lower carbon providers, or it can also be through investing in energy efficiency equipment, which means that they can produce more by using less. When these things are working well together, it will also send an investment signal that that basically lower carbon generation assets will be valued more, and it will also encourage those sort of higher carbon assets that have already approaching their end of life to be decommissioned rather than retrofitted or sort of running beyond their natural end of life. And again, these three things working in unison provides a broad signal that innovative new products, new production technologies, new goods, new services that use carbon more efficiently or provide an alternative that does not use carbon will also be valued. So there's an innovation signal there as well. So how does this work then in the electricity sector? So just to set us up, the electricity sector we know is critical for the low carbon transition. As Benjamin already pointed out, it is also more or less an ideal candidate for coverage under an emissions trading system because the fossil fuel-based generators are sort of large emitters. They have clear installation boundaries, and they also have established MRV protocols. So this means that they're reasonably easy to incorporate under an emissions trading system. And I guess in many contexts, they also do not suffer from the problem of carbon leakage and competitiveness. So that's not true in all emission trading systems, but in many, if the boundary of the ETS is set sort of in line with the power market, then we don't need to be too concerned about sort of trade related aspects. And here you can see this is a chart from ICAP status report that almost all emission trading systems around the world actually cover the power sector. So this sort of is translated into our experience with the policy instrument. Secondly, we can see that the power sector is still a major source of emissions worldwide. According to the IEA's latest analysis, it's about 42% of global emissions, and it still makes up a large share of many jurisdictions' emissions, even though this is declining in some regions. Thirdly, reducing emissions from the power sector is achievable, and it's generally at lower costs than certain other sectors such as transport and industry. And alternative technologies are there, they're ready to be dispersed and deployed, so we just need the appropriate incentives, and carbon pricing can be a really powerful way of actually rewarding these low carbon technologies in the generation mix. And lastly, it's I think if we have any chance of achieving the sort of ambitious targets that we have ahead of us, we know that that low carbon or zero carbon electricity is going to have to play an increasing role in decarbonizing other sectors. And so it's really important that we get on with the challenge of decarbonizing the electricity sector as quickly as possible. And I think that in that context, this is a really interesting discussion because we know that regulation, basically the liberalization process can take time. And so the conventional wisdom in some ways has been we need to liberalize before we can go with a market-based response or a market-based instrument. But the way we wanted to look at this issue is to say, well, what if countries have very good reasons they don't want to liberalize? The liberalization process takes time. The climate can't really wait for this, so we need to figure out how we can actually get on with decarbonizing these power sectors. And then a fundamental question is what role for carbon pricing in this context? So starting with the liberalized setting, here we can see on the left-hand side, we sort of have the characteristics of what we mean when we talk about competitive and liberalized markets. So we mean that basically customers are free to choose their electricity supplier. Electricity is traded in wholesale markets. Generators generally have access to these markets. So if you want to establish an installation and sell your electricity, you have the ability to do so. The generation supply and networks are sort of unbundled. So these are different entities that are operating, which means that there's competition on both the wholesale and the retail market. And there's also independent regulators that are assigned to monitor the market. So these are the sort of conditions that we think of when we think about liberalized electricity sectors. And what underpins all this is something called the merit order curve, which probably many of you are familiar with, but not to understate its importance. What this means is that electricity is dispatched or electricity is called on to to produce, based on the merit of variable operating costs. So we want lower variable operating costs to produce first. This means that renewables that have close to zero variable operating costs come to the first. Then we call, as demand increases, we call on increasingly expensive options as we move up the merit order. And here you can see sort of a classic schedule of renewables moving to nuclear, different grades of coal, be that sort of lignite or high grade coal, gas and oil. Again, this is just a standardized picture. It could differ in terms of the underlying costs of these technologies in different regions. So when we introduce the carbon price into this setting, apologies if this slide is a bit sort of, it's a lot, but it's a really nice slide that I've stolen from Felix Marters, where we can see basically the power that carbon pricing can actually have in these liberalized settings. So what happens fundamentally is that we change the underlying cost structures of the technologies in the merit order. And this leads to something called fuel switching. So rather than calling on coal before gas, we then actually shift gas up the merit order, and therefore gas is operating for longer, and coal is actually pushed back out the merit order. And this has some really important effects. So first of all, it leads to a higher price, so a higher wholesale price, which in this liberalized context is passed on to consumers, so that consumers have an incentive to use electricity more efficiently. Secondly, the wholesale market will actually then reward lower carbon generation. And it does this by allowing low carbon plants to actually run for longer, but also because we now value, we put a price on the input of greenhouse gases in the electricity generation, we have higher wholesale electricity prices. And this means higher margins for low carbon generation technologies. So these two things together, higher prices and plants running for longer, means that the net present value of low carbon assets actually increases as compared to higher carbon assets, creating an investment signal to actually invest in low carbon generation assets. And it also actually devalues the higher carbon assets. So if I'm a high carbon generator, such as a coal facility, I might not be actually called on to produce electricity as often. And I'm also earning lower margins when I do so. So these two things together sort of creates an incentive, or devalues the asset and encourages me to sort of consider shutting it down. But I think what's often ignored in the way that carbon pricing is discussed here is that the way this plays out, even in liberalized sectors or liberalized power markets, is not the same in all countries and all regions. So there's, I think, three things that are critically important. First, the existing capacity mix. Second, the age and profile of the fossil fuel fleet. And third, companion policies. And these three things together will actually impact the role that the ultimate role that the emissions trading system can play. So the existing capacity mix will actually shape that initial merit order. It'll dictate which technologies are actually in the merit order and what proportion of them, at least in the static sense. And this will actually place boundaries around what the opportunities are for fuel switching. And I think we sort of pushed up against this in Europe last year, where there was commentary that we've actually reached the capacity for the coal gas switch to take place until we have new investments in gas. And this, again, is a tricky question in the long-term transition, but it also has an impact in other jurisdictions that might have very high shares of renewable, of let's say small-scale hydro, and less fossil fuels. So the underlying capacity mix is very important for the ultimate role that the carbon price can then play. Secondly, the age of the existing fossil generation fleet is also really important. So if we have countries that actually have old plants, they will have recovered most of their investment costs compared to newer plants, and this will make decommissioning, let's say, less costly. So we have less risks of stranded assets, which means there's also less sort of resistance, less political resistance to the role that carbon pricing can play. And it means that we can have, let's say, a more orderly transition away from these assets towards lower carbon generation technologies. If the fossil fuel fleet is really young, then and we have not recovered the capital costs of those assets, then people might think not towards decommissioning, but also retrofitting these. And so this actually, it changes the incentive structure that we have ultimately that comes about from carbon pricing. And lastly, this is a huge topic that we could have a whole seminar about, but the other companion policies that are in place will also ultimately have a large impact as to what the role of the carbon price actually is. So this is in the liberalized setting, but we know that this is actually so liberalizing competitive markets are to be found, but they're certainly not they're not common, and particularly in certain regions. So we can think of different forms of regulation. We might have liberalized wholesale markets with regulated retail prices. We might have markets with regulated wholesale prices with different sort of tariff methodologies and structures. We can also have vertically integrated markets where the system planning and on investments and decommissioning is done entirely by the government, so not much role for the market in making those decisions. And we can also have regulated planning and production of the actual electricity. So this means that it's not a market that makes the decision on when and which technologies are actually dispatched. And these regulations will interact with an emissions trading system or carbon price more generally in different ways. So firstly, if we think about non-economic dispatch. So as I said, this means that electricity is not prioritized based on its economic merit, but is based on some other criteria. This could be average costs, or it could be broader sort of political criteria. So in this context, it means that the allowance price cannot really drive fuel switching, because the dispatch of electricity isn't based on economic merit, it's based on other criteria. So changing the underlying costs will not necessarily change the dispatch of that electricity. Therefore, we don't see these really important factors of increasing the running hours of low carbon generation. So what we've been looking at is that, well, can you actually tweak the dispatching rules to include some form of net allowance cost or shadow cost into the dispatching formula that would then mimic the impacts of an emissions or of a carbon price in a competitive setting? And this is called green dispatch. And it is something that's been tested in China, and it's also under quite intense discussion in Korea at the moment. I think that this does actually offer some really interesting ways in which we can introduce market-based mechanisms into these sort of quasi-liberalized markets. So when we think about regulated wholesale tariffs, then this is the way in which the tariff structures are set will be really important for whether or not the carbon price can actually find its way into the price of the wholesale electricity. So in many ways, the tariffs are not necessarily all about we don't have marginal pricing, but we have cost recovery. So the tariff wants to be set to focus on making sure that the owner of that asset can recover their costs. So this can be either through a cost plus methodology or a rate of return methodology. And depending on which one you're operating under, then the allocation of your allowances, so whether you're giving lots of them out for free or whether you're actually auctioning them, together with the dispatch formula, will all sort of combine to actually constrain or provide some opportunities for how you can actually reflect the allowance price in the wholesale tariffs. But that said, oops, here we go. That said, even in doing so, if that means that if we're really in a world of cost recovery, if these generators are then basically able to recover all the costs that they actually expend on purchasing allowances and sort of complying with the emissions trading system, then the incentive that the system can have is quite constrained. And so one thing that you can look to is sort of tariffs that are based on some sort of performance criteria. So benchmarks to say, well, you can recover X% of your total allowance costs. And this might be one way of which we can introduce some of the benefits of emissions trading within the wholesale tariffs. But our ability to do this is sort of, again, constrained by what tariff methodology do we have and what is our allocation. And lastly, we have the regulated retail prices. So this is where even if we may have some competitive wholesale markets, we might not want these prices to be passed to the ultimate consumers. And this will constrain the, it'll preclude the incentive for consumers to use electricity more efficiently. So there's two sort of ways of looking at this. One response is to say, well, we can cover the indirect emissions of some consumers. So that is the electricity consumption. We can also bring them into the emissions trading system by then creating an incentive for people to use electricity more efficiently without actually passing on the price through the wholesale, through the sort of market price for electricity. Or we can say, well, to what extent is this really a problem for the time being? Because we know that there's problems in how consumers actually respond to the market price of electricity. So I guess it's a question of how much efficiencies are really lost with regulated retail prices. And so lastly, some concluding thoughts. So an emissions trading system will be most effective in a liberalized and competitive power system, but the market structure and the companion policies that go along with that ETS will shape the role that the emissions trading system will have ultimately in driving mitigation choices. So emission trading systems can still be effective in regulated power markets, but this requires very careful design. So environmental dispatch combined with indirect emissions coverage, I think can provide some of the benefits of an emissions trading system, particularly in the context of where we can then use the we can shift from a setting of more free allocation to more auctioning to slowly increase the costs that are then included into the environmental dispatch as a way of sort of slowly tweaking or ramping up the role for carbon pricing in this system. But ultimately, we will be constrained if we're not willing to pass on any of the costs to the final consumers. And I think this is a much larger discussion around who actually pays for the low carbon transition. And if it's ultimately not going to be the consumers of electricity, then we need to basically fund the generation of electricity and look for opportunities to make that shift through other mechanisms. And lastly, just to touch on a point which I hope we can come back to in the discussion is that even in a liberalized setting, there's big discussions that are going to have to come up as to whether the current marginal pricing design that we have for electricity sectors is appropriate in the longer term transition when we're going to have far greater shares of renewable or variable electricity, which means we may have very long periods of low or even zero electricity prices. And is this, I guess it's an open question to say, is this a stable investment framework for low carbon generation technologies that are going to be in place for decades to come? So with that, I'd like to pass back over to you, Benjamin. Sorry if it took a little bit longer.
No problem at all. Thank you very much, Will, for giving us a crystal clear introduction to the issues at hand and the intricacies of what happens if the textbook meets real life. And indeed, on the last question, what happens in the future, that's a nice one that we can perhaps sort of return to in the discussion round. Before handing over to Cyril, just a reminder to everybody, Javier Hava also already used the opportunity to post a question. All others, of course, invited to enter your questions in the Q&A functions as we go along. But for now, I want to lead over to Cyril. And indeed, because from your Chinese experience, but also your work in other countries around the world with the IEA, I guess exactly this question of what happens if the carbon price is applied in a system which is less than optimal, which is far away from a textbook reality. That should obviously be something that you have some thoughts and reflections on, and perhaps also the question that William also touched upon. The different companion policies that are active in power markets and that have a role to play. How do they sort of interact with ETS? We'd love to hear your thoughts on these questions. So Cyril, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Benjamin. Is the sound okay? Yes, can you
yes,
hear me well?
It is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So hello and happy New Year to everyone. And thanks for the kind introduction, Benjamin, and for the invitation to share the insight with you today. So even within this short notice, it's always a great pleasure to participate in your events. And I'm very happy to see some colleagues and friends today that are connected. I would like, before starting, to apologize in the case that my daughter, which is sleeping in the next room, just get up during the time I'm speaking. So if there is any external noise, so sorry for that. So we have been working at the IEA over the last years on the role of carbon pricing in decarbonizing the power sectors. And we have currently some projects ongoing with countries, so with China, South Africa, and Thailand. And we will start this year in collaboration with ICAP and my colleagues, and we are working together on a series of regional dialogues in Central and Latin America. So I will share some insight here, and I will build from some levels that will have been very clearly presented in this presentation, which is not an easy topic when we address power market regulations and the carbon price on the other side. The biggest trend for the carbon pricing in the power sector, but it's also true for the others, say energy-related sectors, is that it has an effect on the entire economic value chain. So we see different levels, and I will focus on three of them in these comments, which are on investment, on the operation, and on the consumption. So fossil fuel power technology have been, in fact, implicitly subsidized from the beginning. So if we look the point on fossil fuel part, not on the fact on renewable energies that need perhaps some price incentive to develop. So fossil fuel subsidies have been kind of subsidized. So this is regardless that if the capacity expansion is driven by market forces or the administrative decision, the externality costs for emitting CO2 in the atmosphere were never taken into account in the investment decision before. So this led to the heavy reliance on fossil fuels for capacity that we have today. So if we take the example of China, which has half of the coal capacity in operation, which is about 1,000 gigawatt, with a young fleet of about 13 years old in average. So this plant emits about 7% of the global energy-related CO2 emission. Reflecting the cost of carbon in the fuel is thus key to remove these implicit subsidies that fossil fuel plants will use for decades. So if the capacity expansion of your power mix is driven by market forces, so it's important the carbon price stability is one critical element to incentivize investment into low carbon technologies. So if we have an ETS, for example, a carbon floor price with a defined trajectory could provide some certainty of the minimum price levels over time, for example. It is important to avoid any sustained period of undesired low carbon prices. So for example, the EU ETS experienced this after the economic crisis in 2009. So flexibility mechanisms should be part of the ETS. And the EU ETS, for example, implemented a market stability reserve, which allows to adjust the allowance supply to the demand, and thus help to provide more stability in the carbon price. We saw that kind of work for the moment after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic with the price recovery of the carbon market that was quite rapid compared to what happened in South Korea ETS. In the case of the carbon, the capacity expansion of the power plants is administratively defined, so power development plans. So these plans should also reflect the cost of carbon while defining what being defined in an integrated planning process, which integrate many different aspects, such as the supplies, demand, the transmission and distribution, but also the variable renewable energy location and generation patterns, and as well as investments. If we take the example of Thailand Power Development Plan, for example, that has been adopted recently, so plan did not consider any carbon price when being defined, which is also the case for most of the power development plans around the world. So this results in part in a dominant expansion of gas-fired capacity, power plant capacities. So integrating carbon pricing would allow to increase variable renewable ambition and targets through the power development plans while balancing the needs for gas-fired capacity to satisfy the electricity demand. So I would like to add a last comment on the carbon price role on investment. So even in countries which have today quite low carbon electricity supply, it is important to reflect the cost of carbon to direct new investment to low carbon technologies and to avoid any unsustainable new investment in fossil fuel-based power plants. In particular, for Latin American countries, which usually have a high share of hydropower in their mix, When I was working on the region a few years ago, some countries were saying that the CO2 emission for the power sectors would have to increase to keep pace with the growing demand. But in the discussion, these projections that we were discussing did not reflect any carbon cost in the investment decision that was done through the scenarios and the modeling. So I would be very happy to learn more from the colleague Javier's in his presentation, perhaps on Brazil. And I heard very good news that Brazil is looking to implement an ETS, which will cover the power sector first. So the IEA is very pleased to work with Brazil on this question to provide inputs anytime. Our scenario shows that a significant increase in wind and solar PV investment would be needed to decarbonize our power sector. So carbon pricing won't be sufficient to provide the right price signals to enable all this investment that is needed in wind and solar capacity. Companion policies such as capacity auctions and feed-in tariff would also be needed to support the expected scale-up in wind and solar deployment over time. Investment is one thing, which is critical if we want to decarbonize the power sector, since the electricity demand is expected to grow by 50% over the next 20 years. And installed power capacity today will also be reaching their lifetime. But we should not forget that we have today a carbon-intensive existing infrastructure. So if we take all the energy-related infrastructure, and if we consider that we keep operating them as we do it today, we will emit CO2 emission over the next decades that will bring us to an average temperature increase of 1.6 degrees. So the power sectors will account for these emissions, but half of these emissions. It is as vital to manage differently the existing infrastructure. So which means that we need to operate power plants differently. As Will presented, the carbon price has multiple effects on the operation of the power plants. So ideally, in a liberal wholesale market, the carbon price could incentivize switch from most carbon-intensive power technologies to lower carbon technologies, so such as a desired coal to gas shift, for example, or between different coal technologies and efficiencies. It will also increase the clearing electricity price of the wholesale market. That will increase the revenues for low carbon and renewable technologies, so the margins that I can get for that. So integrating carbon price into the wholesale market also can act to reduce the need of feed-in tariff policies or other sort of technology-specific policies to provide them the price incentive to develop, to deploy. The power system using wholesale market to optimize daily operation comprise only half of the global electricity demand today. And this will increase to 70% when China has completed its power market reform. So the carbon price signals, as Will has been discussed and presented, is weakened if the wholesale market is fully or partially regulated. We could see the challenges and the limitations that Korea ETS and the China pilot ETS has been faced for the last years. So both power regulations currently do not reflect the cost of carbon into their wholesale market rules. So Korea is considering to implement a green dispatch system that will reflect the cost of the ETS allowances, which is one of the solutions to move on and integrate more carbon price signals into the dispatch. While China power market reform is ongoing with sports market pilots. So if I comment on the point of Will, if my memory is right, is that Guangdong and South regions has been experiencing some environmental dispatch in the past, but then moved back to the fair dispatch again. And so now with power market reform, they perhaps look at spot market role there. So I want to highlight that the carbon price is not the main driver of this ongoing and discussed power market reform. So the power sector is evolving with more and more electricity, which is generated from variable renewables. So to integrate higher share of variable renewables, enhanced flexibility for plants to operate will be needed. So the electricity pricing will also have to reflect the value of the electricity that will be generating over time. So including the carbon cost, but not only. Ancillary services could provide an interesting price incentive for fossil fuel plants to run less and give more space for low carbon technologies. Carbon pricing and power market reform to integrate more variable renewables while guaranteeing electricity security could be mutually supportive, enhancing the effectiveness of both expected objectives. The effect of carbon pricing on operation is an important mitigation of abatement levels. So as William shown in his figure, it will reduce also the running hours of carbon-intensive technologies, so in particular of coal-fired power plant, thus reducing their revenues and encouraging retrofitting strategies in places in countries where coal fleet is quite young, such as repurposing to provide flexibility services, or fuel switch from coal to gas and biomass, changing the boilers. It could also support early retirement strategies. So depending to the social and the economic contribution of the coal and gas and coal industry in the country mainly, companion policy will be needed to support the social transition for reducing and phasing down coal. So for example, China proposed to implement a particular design of its ETS, which allocates allowances based on technology CALB specific benchmarks expressed in tons of CO2 per megawatt hour. So this allows to adjust the mitigation effort that is requested by technology type while encouraging efficiency improvement and switch to more efficient technologies. So the effectiveness of the ETS in China will rely directly on the stringency of the benchmark values and the reductions rate over time. And ideally, if the benchmark can progressively be merged to a single benchmark, which could include fossil fuel-based power technologies and renewable energy. We have been assessing in collaboration with Tsinghua University the role of China ETS in decarbonizing the power sectors, and our analysis should be published in April this year. Another point that we didn't discuss yet, but I think it's important, is the opportunity cost in the liberalized wholesale market. So the EU ETS first phase of implementation allocated allowances for free to the power sectors, which resulted to the windfall profit, with the producer transferring the economic value of the freely received allowances to the wholesale market and to the end users. So the auctioning of allowances would be then needed in the case of a liberalized wholesale market. This brings me to the last layer of mitigation action, if I still have 2 or 3 minutes, which is the price increase of carbon-intensive commodities. So for any carbon pricing instrument, such as ETS, tax, or others, it is critical to consider the carbon cost effect on the end user price. So for the power sectors, in countries with some share of fossil fuel-based electricity generation, some electricity production will increase due to the carbon cost. So the cost of electricity production will increase. So companion policy should be considered to address the equity issues or to support vulnerable groups of this price increase. There is also ways to reconcile carbon pricing and energy taxes through excise taxes on electricity consumption that could be adjusted to balance the increased effect of carbon price on the electricity cost of production. Revenues neutral carbon tax systems, such as British Columbia, could also compensate the end user price increase. And in an ETS system in cap and trade, for example, in California, the use of consignment auction has been utilized to limit the variation of electricity prices to the end users and the retail market. To summarize, there is no single policies to decarbonize the power sector. So carbon pricing has the advantage to enable mitigation and adoption from investment, operation, and consumption. So it's transversal to the whole economic value chain. Carbon pricing policy design needs to be tailored to the country's circumstances. And I would like to add that, of course, it also needs to be designed to their intended role and functions within their own climate and energy policy package. So it is a learning by doing process, and I am very pleased to share my insight with you today. I stop here, and I look forward for the Q&A sessions. I give you back the floor, Benjamin. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Cyril, for walking us through some of the real life intricacies. And I think also, indeed, one of the reminders that carbon pricing, of course, obviously takes different forms in different contexts, but also has different functions. And particularly here, the reminder that you know, whereas here in Europe, it's about mostly about now phasing out the fossil intensive generators. In other parts of the world, it's much more about making sure that these fossil intensive power generation is not being built in the first place. So this division that we heard earlier about, you know, operational versus investment impacts obviously breaks down quite differently in different countries, and that you would expect also has implications for the instrument choice and instrument design. So on that note of sort of one country that is in a very specific situation I'll use this as a segue to then move over to Brazil and ask Javier in a moment to walk us through what the situation is like. And I think Brazil obviously is a very particular and interesting example in the sense that, as we've seen in William's early presentation, it's not a fully liberalized power market. At the same time, it's a country that has experimented with market-based elements like the auction, the capacity auctions, at a time when these things were quite unheard of in Europe. And so there is certainly a willingness and interest to bring market-based elements into the operation of the sector. And it's of course also a very particular sector in the sense that it's continues to be dominated by renewables, and so might as well also give us some insights as to William's last question. What does the carbon price do in a system that has very high shares of renewables. Now, obviously, also as was mentioned, Brazil doesn't have a carbon price yet, but Cyril mentioned, there is hope that something might be on the horizon. And I guess also from your work, you might have some insights as to, if there was a carbon price, what would it do to Brazil's energy system, and how ready would Brazil's energy system be to function with a carbon price in it? And so I'd invite you to give us share your thoughts on these and other questions with us. Javier, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Benjamin. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for your introduction, Benjamin. And I would like to thank the invitation for this panel, to the ICAP and all people involved. It's an honor to discuss such relevant theme for the carbon pricing, and since it plays a major role in the emissions. As William said, it's very complex to introduce a carbon pricing in the electricity sector, since it has different levels of regulation. And following your suggestion, I'm gonna present quickly an overview of the Brazilian electricity sector, and then just to how can I say, just for food or thoughts, and then we can discuss afterwards. So Brazil, it's a large country with regard its continental distance and its sizable power system. Yes, one of the prominent features of the Brazilian power sector is the participation of the hydropower, similar to Canada, Norway, and Colombia. However, unlike these countries, the hydropower capacity in Brazil, it's associated with large reservoirs, which work as energy regulators. So just for you to have a notion, Brazil has an installed capacity. It's about 190 gigawatts of plants, and 66% of the energy produced is by the hydropower, about 20% for thermoelectrics, and about 10% and the rest of the renewable variable energy, such aeolic and solar. And as I mentioned, the thermoelectric dispatch here in Brazil, it's dispatch according with the hydrological conditions. So the situation is different from Europe, for instance, where they are base load plants. Here, it's the plants provide a mid-merit generations, and the thermoelectrics here, it's mainly natural gas, followed by coal, oil, and diesel. Yes, So Brazil has one big interconnected system dividing in four subsystems. The sector is mainly private, but it still coexists with state-owned companies in all subsectors, generation, transmission, and discos, but they are unbundled. Regarding with the market structure, we have in Brazil here two markets, one a regulated market and a free market. The regulated market represents 70% of the market, and the energy, it's mainly contracted by auctions, where discos buy energy in these auctions settled by the government, right? And here in Brazil, consumers don't have the options to choose the discos. We have here regional distribution companies. And we also have here a free contracted market where negotiations take place freely between industry agencies and generators or free markets consumers. And here we also have a small short-term market just to settle the difference between the contracts, right? And this price, it's not defined by the forces of the market. The price is here, the settlement price, they are decided through optimization software based on marginal operation costs. And recently, this year, we introduced hourly base settlement price. Okay, but until last year, it was a weekly price for the market. Regarding the renewable, variable renewables. Hello, can you hear me? Regarding the renewable variable sources, they are highly subsidized. We spend about $3 billion per year in order to make them competitive. But we also have coal subsidies. It's about $300 million per year. And they say it's about some regional development issue, but it's questionable, right? Here the dispatch model is centralized and doesn't consider any environmental externalities, such emissions. However, for the next 10 years, the government plans to phase out all diesel and oil plants and replace them by natural gas plants. Just one, since I start mentioning about the future, we here in Brazil, we are discussing the modernization of the sector and trying to liberalize it more. One of the main issue of the Brazilian electricity sector is that the energy and the capacity are bundled. You have just one contract, and we are discussing how to unbundle and create an energy-only market and the capacity market. And since we are revising, how can I say, we are reviewing the market structure, there is a room, and we start discussing how to introduce a carbon price or a variable that considers the environmental issue. So free market are growing fast, and variable renewable sources already have competitive prices, so it wouldn't need subsidies anymore. And most importantly is that meteorological conditions are changing. It's raining less than the average of the long term, and it is expected an increase of thermoelectric dispatch for the next 10 years. I did a recent study that I tried to measure the potential market for the Brazilian electricity sector for the carbon price for a carbon market, and if those emissions were auctioned, government could recycle between 500 million and $800 million per year, and could use them for a just transition. And just for the final remark is that despite of that, we here have a renewable energy mix. The new renewables are variable, so we would need more thermoelectric dispatch because of a security matter. So I think that we have a potential for recycling revenues and support the just transitions initiatives and also initiatives towards the net zero. I'm open for more questions and details about the Brazilian electricity sector. I didn't know how much time I had, so I prepared just a quick overview, and I'm open for questions.
Excellent. Many thanks, muito obrigado, Javier. That was spot on, also in terms of time. Now we do have some time left now, and this is where the question answer part should start. I just want to remind you to please be so kind to enter your questions in the chat or in the question and answer function, and then we can relay them to the speakers, to the panelists, and also if you do so. Feel free to address them to a particular speaker or to all of them if you want to hear different views. And also just want to flag up that for those who haven't been following the chat, there was a question about additional literature, and we're in the lucky position that we acknowledge it's a very complex topic, but fortunately William and colleagues made a heroic effort to put these things into context and to structure them. And as a result, there's two reports that Michael Mehling shared earlier, which are really great reading to kind of get into the substance and understand the issues, and also get acquired with the language, which is tricky in itself. Now, perhaps as we sort of move then to the question answer part, I wanted to kick off with a question to basically, well, all three, which indeed goes to this point that William touched upon in his at the end of his presentation, as to, you know, we're now in a world where power markets are changing quite drastically in many countries of the world. This particular country, Germany, we know 5 years ago we were still dominated by coal. The coal was still the dominant fuel type. This year, for the first time, renewables provided more than 50% or more than half of the, or sorry, last year, renewables provided more than half of the electricity generated. And by the end of the decade, we'll be somewhere between 65 and 80%. That's at least the political targets. So we will move into a market that is in a way similar to what Brazil already has. So a market that is dominated by renewables. And so therefore the question is, in that market, obviously that the market setup will look a bit different, as to, there would be probably other ways of compensating generation, not only the energy only market but also other channels. What does it do to the power price, and what are kind of the questions and problems that we can run into in this type of market? And I'd like to put perhaps William on the spot, if you have some thoughts and ideas as to how that could really look like, given that nobody probably really knows the answer to that, but perhaps your answer will do.
Yeah, perhaps my answer will do. I will give it a go. Before I do, I also just wanted to acknowledge Marisa Montes de Oca Leon is on the call, and she was also instrumental in some of that early work at ICAP to advance some of these issues. So just wanted to give a shout out. So on your question though, so I see this as there's sort of two competing camps in thinking through how this could happen. And so the one would be that the marginal pricing is the way to go, and that we stick with an energy only market. And what this means is scarcity needs to be very, very highly valued when it comes about. So it's fine if we have long periods of very low, even zero electricity prices, so long as the investments can recoup their costs during periods of scarcity when the price goes potentially very high. And this means that we need this basically brings into focus policies such as price caps, which have sort of been designed to prevent prices from going very high. But if that is the way forward, then you need to make sure that I would say that we probably can't have price caps in place, because it's going to be short periods of time when there's scarcity in the market that basically the prices go very, very high, and then that remunerates more or less the generation or the operation, the capital costs of those assets. And there's another group of people that say, well, that's potentially not very credible. I'm not sure that investors would be happy with making such a long-term investment decision on the back of an assumption that regulators will let the electricity price sort of go through the roof during short periods of time, but then remain very, very low for other periods. So this means we need basically different market structures that move away from the marginal pricing and value the different components of an electricity system that are going to be really important when we have much higher shares of dispersed renewables. So this is sort of flexibility, demand response, being able to ramp up quickly, shut off quickly, to actually support a power system that is more decentralized, and with basically can have large swings in electricity, in the amount of electricity that could be supplied at any point in time. And if that is the case, then I think we need to start paying more attention to the portion of electricity that's valued outside of the energy only market, with these sorts of mechanisms such as the capacity reserves, because I guess it's very possible these continue to play an increasing role, and we need to make sure that they're designed so that we get let's say those key aspects of the system that we need, so backup capacity, flexibility, but also that we do that in a way that is consistent with the transition and is least carbon. So these, I think, are just sketching the realm of possibilities there. And I think it's a question that sort of deserves a little bit more attention in the ongoing discussions.
Great. Thanks a lot, William. Cyril, do you also want to comment on that question? I'm not sure if you have your IEA crystal ball ready to answer this question of how the other components of an electricity market, how the carbon component could be integrated into those. But perhaps you've encountered that question as well in your work.
Thanks a lot, Benjamin. I don't have much to add compared to what William said. It's also a question that is mainly addressed by our colleagues from the power sector, market and regulations. I'm very pleased to share some contacts for next event if you want to focus more on these discussions. But anyway, regarding that, the price could fly high when there is strong scarcity on the market. It's something that's already happening in Europe. Sometimes the price going over 500-600 euro a megawatt hour, and going back to lower levels. I would say, anyway, of the market regulation design, the carbon cost, which is an externality cost that should have been integrated into our economic decision previously, should still be remaining in it. There is no way to bring it for a few years and then try to think, yes, we need to remove it because it's not so much useful anymore, and there is a majority of variable renewables. It's still here to provide the right price signals on the degradation made on climate change, and could be also the other element if there is any environmental consideration that could be considered in the future.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks. Then I think in the interest of time, then we'll move to the questions from the audience and bring in Javier into the discussion, because there were actually two questions explicitly aimed your way. The first one being, if you see a role for carbon pricing in Brazil's plans to go towards net zero, if you think that which role the carbon price could have in that endeavor. And then more specifically, there was a question from Pedro on the split electricity grid that Brazil has between north, center, and south. In what way that actually presents a complication for carbon pricing in the Brazilian electricity sector, and if there's any plans to unify the Brazilian grid. So if you want, then share with us your insights on these two questions.
Excuse me, Benjamin, would you repeat the last one? I didn't.
The last one was about the electricity grid in Brazil specifically, which apparently is split between the north, center, and the south. And the question, to what extent this sort of two systems in one country, the split grid, to what extent that complicates future plans for carbon pricing.
I see. Okay. Regarding the role of the carbon price towards net zero, I think that particularly for the electricity sector, since it is already renewable, I think the role is to raise revenues or to recycling the revenues and invest in companion policies or protect the social, the vulnerable social people, and also, since they are planning to phase out some fossil fuels, fossil plants, these recycled revenues could use to, how can I say that, to be invested in this employment issue, right? So I think that we have enough revenue to start investing in companion policies and other aspects of the net zero. And also in technologies, here in Brazil, we are discussing a lot the CCS, the CCS investment and the CCS technologies, particularly for the coast zones where they drill oil. So carbon prices still plays a major role here, even in renewable mixes, in countries with renewable mixes. And the isolated, and regarding the second question, here in Brazil, we just have one isolate state and some regions in the Amazon where they are, when they have isolated grids, they are not interconnected. And in those places, they are discussing and implementing hybrid hybrid grids or hybrid energy sources like such as natural gas or the other fossils like oil, fuel oil, and solar or bioenergy and this stuff. So it's the isolated country, the isolated area. It's about 4% of the total consumption. So it wouldn't prevent a carbon pricing instrument for the electricity sector in Brazil.
I think you were just frozen for a second there. Good. Thank you very much, Javi. Then there's two more questions that came in from the audience, and I guess for both of these, Will might have a thought. The first one was from a moment ago from Javier Jaraba. Sorry, I'm butchering your second name here. But from Javier on this question of, is there a way to include other environmental impacts beyond greenhouse gas emissions? So things like biodiversity loss and land use, etc., materials use. And I guess sort of behind this question that if you move all renewables, then that certainly reduces your greenhouse gas emissions, but has implications for on biodiversity, as we certainly have observed from with biofuel production. So is there a good way to incorporate those impacts in an ETS? And the second question from Dora from Taiwan on what actually happens if the electricity price is not passed on to consumers? Is there still, or what is then still the most effective way to bring about change in the electricity sector? Change the power structure. So if you want, William, then give us your thoughts on these two questions.
Thank you, Benny, and thanks also for the questions. So the first one, I think that there's an interesting strand of literature that from a couple of years ago about looking at, so not precisely the questions that are asked there, but looking at how emissions trading systems or carbon pricing can be combined to also tackle local pollutants. So these are local pollutants that are sort of combined with the emissions of power plants. And I think that there are ways of potentially doing this by putting some different emission factors or different compliance factors onto the compliance obligations of certain emitters to make it even more costly for those that have a higher local pollutant impact. And so you can argue whether that's a good or bad idea and whether you should really combine an instrument that is ultimately targeting greenhouse gas emissions with also another task of addressing local air pollution. But there's ways in which you can do that. But your particular questions on the biodiversity side and the more land use side, I think, are more problematic to do with an instrument such as emission trading systems. And I would say that it's true, and it's a really fair concern about the way in which this vast need that we're going to have for renewable energy and things as to what impact that'll ultimately have. And I think that this is a question that needs to be seriously tackled in the sort of licensing and approval processes that we have for these major investments. And I think that we're starting a process to look at this because these are ultimately questions that are normally that take a lot of time, and there's a lot of environment impact assessment, different sort of research and things that is done before a license is granted. And some people are saying, well, can we achieve the transition that we need with all these regulations in place? Isn't there a way in which we can streamline this? And other people are saying, well, there's actually this is something that's really important and concerning, and we might need stricter processes to make sure that we protect the biodiversity that we have left. And so I think it's a super valid question, and that's not really a direct answer. Ultimately, I don't think the biodiversity issue can be tackled well within the design of an emissions trading system, though. So on the second question, so yeah, this is a fundamental constraint of an emissions trading system in a regulated context where there's no possibility to reflect the operating or the greenhouse gas costs and the electricity price. So the one way in which both Korea and China in the Chinese pilots have tackled this is to say, well, we don't want to increase the electricity price, but there are some consumers that we think could bear additional costs. And so we're going to do that through a mechanism where we make them liable for the indirect emissions associated with their electricity consumption. So then you actually you increase the scope of the ETS to also include some scope 3 emissions of electricity. And I think that this can be an effective way of sending a signal to some very large downstream or electricity consumers. But I think ultimately it's, but in that setting, you miss out on quite a few of the, I would say, more important mitigation levers on the generation and investment side. So I think that with these sorts of ways of covering indirect emissions should probably be viewed as transitional tools that can sort of go hand in hand with hopefully a process where we do start to reflect some costs in the carbon emissions in the electricity pricing. And so combining this with environmental dispatch is one promising way of doing that, because so what we say here is that we're going to let the net allowance costs be reflected in the dispatch criteria or the dispatch formula. So that's not the opportunity cost, it's simply what the generators pay in terms of purchasing allowances from the market. So if you have very high shares of free allocation, this could be really small, which means that at first the impacts on the dispatching system will be quite small, but it gives the regulator a sort of ratcheting mechanism that they can slowly increase the stringency of the allocation and put more and more obligations on the generators to actually purchase more allowances, and those generators, then the cost of that will be considered in the dispatching decisions. And then hopefully this goes hand in hand with a broader societal discussion about, well, what is the way in which we're going to achieve the low carbon transition? Who's going to pay for this? How do we make it progressive so that we can ultimately free up electricity prices, but do so in a way that does not impact sort of disproportionately impact low income households and sort of have a fair and just transition.
Mm. Great, thank you very much. Which indeed is, I guess, sort of a topic for another day's podcast. The whole question of the social impacts of carbon pricing and how to mitigate them. And obviously, this is the one key concern if you talk about deregulation of electricity prices, that disproportionately affects poorer households. At the same time, I think we also have observed throughout the world that keeping energy prices low is perhaps sometimes an effective way of getting money, but it's an extremely inefficient way of channeling money to poor households, because obviously poor households are happy, but so are of course not so poor households. Now we are drawing to a close here. There's about 4 minutes left. What I would sort of then invite you is sort of just one round of closing remarks from the 3 panelists. You can if you want to, you don't have to if you don't want to, but if you want to sort of share your sort of your takeaway points and insights from this discussion, it's a thick, it's a broad area that we've tried to cover in short time. But if you want to sort of leave us with sort of your own sort of key messages or takeaway points from this discussion, what should sort of people take home from this discussion in thinking about ETS and power prices and how they fit together? If you can, then squeezed into, I say, 1 minute. And I'll put you on the spot, Javier, to go. You were sort of last in presenting, and now sort of first with your final words.
Okay. I would like to thank everyone for the attention and the questions. And I just would like to say that the carbon pricing in regulated markets are more complicated, but it is possible. And there are some instruments that could allow the pass-through of the signal price from the generation to the final consumer, consumption and consumers. And just we have to try to identify where the barriers are to make the pass-through possible. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you very much. Then over to you, Cyril. What are your sort of your main messages or your main takeaway points from the discussion here?
Thanks a lot. So my daughter just woke up, she's in my room, but I try to be short. I think if you look at the aspect of climate change, so CO2 emissions, then the carbon price is the right instrument to provide the price signals to everyone that emit 1 ton of CO2, but also to give some benefits to the ones that are clean. So as we see, it could increase the margin revenues from low carbon technology and renewables. And in this case, I think there is a lot of other policies that come into place that are technology specific or sectorial specific. And if we look at the renewables, variable renewables only, wind and solar, feed-in tariff has been very promising to direct investment and to deploy the technologies. But today's countries, as China could not support the feed-in tariff schemes anymore, the fund is too small. Or you see in Spain, they stopped the feed-in tariff, changed the regulated price that was affected tariff to this feed-in tariff. In France, they tried to do the same thing, which just destroy kind of the dynamics and the scale of deployment of this project on PV, so zero PV, for example. And it's important, even if the cost become in competition with fossil fuel energies, the value of the electricity that produce is different than fossil fuel-based energies. So I would say the carbon price is kind of a very good instrument in the way if you want to decarbonize power sectors, providing this price signals incentive to fossil fuel-based, but also the benefits to renewable technologies are competing together within the single market, in the same market for the same commodity.
Great. Thank you very much, Cyril. And then we can return to you the parenting duties in a moment, which also awaits me, when we wrap this up here. William, your final thoughts and remarks on this topic.
Yeah, many thanks, and also to the panelists and everyone for the great questions. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I think that when looking across all countries, all power systems, and we know that we need to basically decarbonize, and the power sector has to come as soon as possible. So it's it can't be a question of well, we do this if and when we liberalize. So then the question is, what role for a carbon price vis-a-vis other companion policies? And I think that really is very specific to the market structures and regulations in different countries, and that needs to be considered. Yeah, that needs to be basically considered as soon as possible, so we get credible decarbonization strategies for the power sector in all regions across the world. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you very much, William. And indeed, thanks to all of you. Well, thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us here today, for making time in your busy schedule to join us in this webinar. Thanks above all to the 3 panelists for doing an excellent job and walking us through this tricky topic. And of course, thanks to the European Commission, who decided to make this to support this activity and therefore made it possible for us to be here today. So thanks all around. I want to close here, not without announcing the next round of this webinar series, which is coming up on the 10th of February. And we'll send around sort of invites and reminders through the same channels. Which will look at another sector, but then possibly, if the power sector is the ideal candidate for carbon pricing, then the sector which we're going to look at the next time is perhaps the least usual, or the most tricky sector. We will tackle, however, the question of what can carbon pricing contribute to land use, agriculture, and forestry, and reducing emissions from those sectors. So perhaps again taking a look at Brazil, but perhaps also at other countries that share similar issues. Stay tuned for that, and feel free to join us again on the 10th of February for another round of discussion there. For this session, just a reminder, there were questions in the chat about the about the slides that William showed, and we'll send them out by email. We do hope that for the next time we should have the website up and running, that you can access the slides from this webinar, but also from the next and the previous iterations on a simple web platform. So on that note, thanks a lot to everybody, and well, have a great afternoon, morning, or evening, whatever it is, wherever you're joining us from. Stay safe and stay sane. All right, bye.
Everyone, bye-bye.